Using his close position to the king, he slipped the poison into Alexander's drink. It was this poison that ultimately spoke doom for Alexander.
In the sweltering heat of a Babylonian summer in 323 BCE, the most powerful man in the known world lay dying. Alexander the Great, who had conquered lands from Greece to India, was about to face the one enemy he couldn't defeat. At just 32 years old, the man who had never lost a battle succumbed to a mysterious illness that continues to baffle historians and medical experts to this day. Was it poison slipped into his wine by jealous generals? A tropical disease contracted during his campaigns? Or perhaps the consequence of his legendary drinking habits? The circumstances surrounding Alexander's final days have spawned countless theories, each more intriguing than the last. This enduring mystery has captivated scholars for over 2 millennia, and the truth may be more complex than we imagine. But to truly understand the enigma of Alexander's death, we must first follow his footsteps through his final triumphant campaigns and into that fateful banquet where his legendary life began its unexpected conclusion. The last military campaign of Alexander's life was not against a foreign enemy, but against a people he once considered his own. In 324 BCE, Alexander led an expedition against the Kosaans, a mountain tribe in modern-day Iran. This campaign, often overlooked in the grand narrative of his conquests, was more punitive than strategic, a show of force to secure his eastern frontiers. The mountain fighting was brutal, with Alexander displaying the same tactical brilliance that had served him throughout his career. But those close to him noticed something different about their king. Alexander had been wounded numerous times throughout his campaigns. An arrow to the chest in India, a crushing blow to his head during the siege of Gaza, and countless other injuries that had left their mark on his body. But now battle fatigue seemed to weigh on him more heavily than before. Sources describe him as increasingly irritable, suffering from bouts of melancholy and displaying a paranoia that hadn't been characteristic of his earlier years. His body was covered with scars, not all of them honorable, wrote the Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus, alluding to injuries sustained not just in battle but in drunken brawls with his own men. These accumulated traumas, combined with the psychological toll of constant warfare, had begun to change Alexander. By early 323 BCE, Alexander had returned to Babylon, the city he intended to make the capital of his vast empire. Here he began planning his next grand campaign, an invasion of Arabia that would further expand his already unprecedented dominion. Maps were drawn, fleets assembled, and troops gathered from across his territories, even as his body showed signs of wear. His ambition remained boundless. In the weeks before his final illness, Alexander was occupied with administrative duties, receiving embassies from distant lands and dealing with the complex logistics of governing his diverse empire. He also oversaw the funeral arrangements for his close friend Hephaestion, who had died several months earlier, a loss that had reportedly devastated the king and from which some say he never fully recovered emotionally. As spring turned to early summer in Babylon, Alexander was observed participating in sacrificial rituals, inspecting his naval preparations, and attending to matters of state. According to the ancient sources, he showed no obvious signs of the catastrophic illness that was about to strike him down. Yet some of his contemporaries later claimed to have noticed subtle changes in his demeanor, perhaps the earliest nearly imperceptible indications that something was amiss with the health of the world's most powerful man. The fatal feast in Babylon. The pivotal moment in Alexander's final chapter came in early June of 323 BCE at what would become one of history's most infamous dinner parties. After a day spent dealing with administrative matters and receiving omens that some of his soothsayers considered troubling, Alexander accepted an invitation to dine at the home of one of his companions, Medius of Larissa. The banquet began like many others in Alexander's life, with flowing wine and animated conversation among his trusted circle. The setting would have been opulent even by Babylonian standards. Reclining on cushioned couches in the Persian fashion that Alexander had adopted, the guests were served exotic delicacies from across the vast empire. Meats seasoned with rare spices from India, fruits from distant orchards, and wine mixed according to Greek custom. Alexander was known for his prodigious capacity for alcohol, a trait he reportedly inherited from his father, Philip II of Macedon. On this particular evening, according to multiple ancient accounts, he drank heavily. Plutarch writes that he drank all the next day and continued carousing until dawn. Some accounts suggest he consumed a massive quantity of unmixed wine, a departure from the Greek custom of diluting wine with water, draining a large vessel called the Cup of Heracles in one extended draught. The details of what happened next vary slightly between ancient sources, but all agree on one crucial point. After draining his cup, Alexander suddenly gasped as if struck by a spear, crying out in pain and clutching his back. According to Plutarch, he was seized with a sharp pain in the back as if he had been pierced by a spear and was carried to his bed. This dramatic moment, a seemingly healthy young conqueror suddenly struck down in the midst of celebration, would later fuel suspicions of foul play. Was this the moment when poison took effect? Did someone among his trusted companions seize an opportunity to eliminate the increasingly unpredictable king? The morning after the banquet found Alexander feverish and in obvious distress. Initially, some hoped it might be merely the effects of his notorious drinking, a severe hangover that would pass with time and rest. But as the day progressed, his condition deteriorated rather than improved. The pain intensified, the fever climbed, and Alexander's legendary strength began to fade. Still conscious and determined, Alexander reportedly attempted to maintain his daily routine, making sacrifices to the gods and discussing military matters with his generals. But it quickly became apparent that this was no ordinary illness. Alexander ordered his couch moved to beside the bath, hoping that immersion in water might provide some relief from his mounting agony. It didn't. 12 days of agony. What followed the initial onset of Alexander's illness was a harrowing descent into suffering that ancient chroniclers documented in disturbing detail. For approximately 12 days, the conqueror of the known world lay racked with pain, his legendary strength diminishing hour by hour as his closest companions watched in helpless horror. By the second day after the banquet, Alexander's symptoms had intensified dramatically. The fever that had begun as a troubling sign now raged through his body. According to Plutarch, he suffered from a continuous fever, consuming and violent. Modern medical historians have noted that this description is consistent with several potential diagnoses, from malaria to typhoid fever. The pain that had first manifested in his back now seemed to consume his entire body. Alexander was reportedly unable to find comfort in any position. When he would lie down, the pain would force him upright. When sitting up became unbearable, he would attempt to lie down again in a futile cycle of agony. His physicians, among the most skilled in the ancient world, tried everything in their considerable arsenal: herbal preparations, cooling baths, bloodletting, but nothing seemed to provide lasting relief. By the fourth day, Alexander developed another ominous symptom, an unquenchable thirst. He drank continually, but no amount of liquid could satisfy him. This extreme polydipsia, as medical professionals would now term it, suggests several possibilities to modern doctors. Perhaps kidney failure, diabetes insipidus triggered by an infection, or the body's desperate attempt to fight raging hypothermia. Sleep eluded the suffering king. Arrian writes that Alexander experienced violent insomnia, further weakening his already compromised condition. In his rare moments of fitful sleep, attendants reported that he would mumble commands to his armies or call out to gods and heroes of legend. The line between waking agony and feverish dreams began to blur. By the sixth day, Alexander could no longer speak clearly. His voice, once capable of rallying thousands of soldiers to battle, had become a raspy whisper. Those closest to him had to lean in to catch his fading words. It was around this time that the Macedonian soldiers, growing increasingly concerned about their king, demanded to see him. Whether out of genuine concern or to verify rumors that Alexander was already dead, they insisted on passing by his bedside. In what would become one of the most poignant moments of his final days, Alexander, though barely able to move, forced himself to raise his head and acknowledge each soldier as they filed past his bed. He couldn't speak, but he recognized them with his eyes and a slight movement of his hand, the last commands he would ever give to the men who had followed him across the world. As the illness progressed into its final days, Alexander's body began to shut down systematically. He developed jaundice, his skin and eyes taking on a yellowish hue that indicated severe liver distress. The fever continued unabated, and at times he fell into periods of delirium, alternating with moments of lucidity where he seemed to understand that his end was approaching. On what is believed to be the 11th day of his illness, Alexander reportedly lost his ability to speak entirely. When asked to whom he bequeathed his empire, he could only remove his signet ring and pass it to Perdiccas, one of his generals, a gesture that would be interpreted in various ways by those vying for power. The poison theory. Of all the theories surrounding Alexander's death, perhaps none has captured the imagination more persistently than the possibility of poison. This theory, far from being a modern invention, appears in several ancient sources. Plutarch mentions that most writers believed Alexander was poisoned, though he himself expresses skepticism. Diodorus Siculus more confidently asserts that Alexander died from poison, while Justin explicitly names Antipater as the mastermind behind the alleged assassination. But who would dare to poison the most powerful man in the world, and why? The list of potential suspects is surprisingly long, reflecting the complex web of rivalries, resentments, and ambitions that surrounded Alexander in his final years. Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, stands as the most frequently cited suspect. The relationship between the two had deteriorated significantly in the years before Alexander's death. Antipater had governed Macedonia effectively during Alexander's decade-long absence, perhaps too effectively. Sources suggest Alexander had become suspicious of Antipater's growing power and had summoned him to Babylon, ostensibly to report on his regency, but perhaps with more sinister intentions. Fearing for his own life, Antipater may have decided to strike first. If Antipater was indeed the architect of assassination, he likely didn't act alone. His son Cassander had recently arrived in Babylon, supposedly to explain his father's reluctance to answer Alexander's summons. Ancient sources claim that Alexander and Cassander had a hostile encounter, with the king mocking Cassander's obeisance to Persian custom. Could Cassander have carried the poison from Macedonia, perhaps concealed in a mule's hoof, as some ancient writers dramatically suggest? The mechanics of the alleged poisoning center around the royal cupbearer, Iolus, another of Antipater's sons. As the official responsible for tasting and serving the king's wine, Iolus would have had the perfect opportunity to introduce poison into Alexander's drink during the fateful banquet at Medius's house. The fact that Alexander reportedly cried out in pain immediately after drinking has fueled this suspicion for centuries. Some theorists have even implicated Aristotle, Alexander's former tutor. The relationship between the philosopher and his royal student had soured after Alexander executed Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, for allegedly participating in a conspiracy against the king. Could the great philosopher have provided the poison using his extensive knowledge of toxic substances? The poison itself is another matter of speculation. Some ancient sources suggest strychnine, which causes severe muscle spasms and could explain Alexander's intense back pain. Others propose arsenic, which produces symptoms similar to those described in Alexander's final days: fever, thirst, and eventually organ failure. White hellebore, a plant known to ancient Greek physicians, is another candidate, as it causes intense burning sensations and gradual deterioration. Modern toxicologists who have reviewed the ancient accounts point out that the progression of Alexander's illness, lasting nearly 2 weeks with gradually worsening symptoms, is inconsistent with most fast-acting ancient poisons. However, some suggest that a carefully calculated dose of a heavy metal poison like arsenic could produce a delayed death that mimicked natural illness, providing the perfect cover for assassination. The poison theory gained further credibility in the power struggles that followed Alexander's death. Olympias, Alexander's mother, apparently believed the poisoning narrative wholeheartedly. Years later, when she temporarily gained power in Macedonia, she had Iolus's tomb desecrated and sought vengeance against Cassander and others she suspected of involvement in her son's death. Deadly waters of the Styx. Perhaps the most fascinating poisoning theory involves not a jealous general or a vengeful philosopher, but a legendary river from Greek mythology. According to this account, Alexander was poisoned with water from the river Styx, the boundary between Earth and the underworld in Greek mythology, whose waters were said to be so toxic they could dissolve any container except one made from a horse's hoof. This extraordinary claim appears in several ancient sources, including Plutarch, who mentions it while expressing skepticism. According to this theory, Antipater sent his son Cassander to Babylon with a special poison, water collected from the Styx and transported in a container made from a horse's hoof, the only vessel that could contain the deadly liquid without being destroyed. But is there any truth to this seemingly fantastical story? Surprisingly, modern geology suggests there might be. The river Styx was not merely mythological, but corresponded to a real location in Arcadia, Greece. The modern Mavronary, meaning black water, is believed to be the ancient Styx, and it has some unusual properties. The water flows through rocks composed of limestone and toxic minerals, including compounds of arsenic and caliche. Scientific analysis of the Mavronary has revealed high concentrations of potentially deadly bacteria and minerals. The water contains microorganisms that produce caliciamycin, an extremely potent compound capable of breaking DNA strands. In sufficient concentrations, water from this source could indeed be lethal. Even more intriguing is the fact that this poisonous water has unusual chemical properties that could corrode certain metals and materials, while potentially being safely contained in keratin-based vessels like animal hooves. The ancient accounts of water that could only be transported in a horse's hoof suddenly seem less fanciful and more like an early understanding of chemical compatibility. If Alexander was indeed poisoned with water from the Styx, his symptoms align with what we might expect. The gradual onset, persistent fever, increasing pain, and eventual organ failure would be consistent with heavy metal poisoning from arsenic-laden water. The bacterial content could have caused infection and sepsis, contributing to his decline. The practicalities of transporting water from Greece to Babylon, a journey of over 1,000 miles, remain questionable. Would the water retain its toxic properties after such a long journey? Could it be preserved in a way that maintained its potency? These questions have led some historians to dismiss the Styx theory as elaboration upon the more straightforward poisoning narrative. However, the theory has a certain poetic resonance that has kept it alive throughout history. There is something powerfully symbolic about the conqueror who styled himself as divine being felled by waters from the boundary of the underworld, as if the gods themselves had decided to humble Alexander's ambition. The medical mystery. While poisoning theories have dominated popular imagination, modern medical researchers approaching Alexander's death find compelling evidence for natural causes. Based on detailed symptomatic descriptions from ancient sources, contemporary physicians have retroactively diagnosed the conqueror with various conditions that might explain his rapid decline. Malaria stands as perhaps the most widely accepted medical explanation. Babylon in summer provided an ideal environment for malaria-carrying mosquitoes, with its marshes and canals creating perfect breeding grounds. Alexander's symptoms, the sudden onset of fever, the pattern of intense pain, and the gradual deterioration over days align with what we now recognize as falciparum malaria, the most dangerous form of the disease. Dr. David Oldak of the University of Maryland, who conducted an extensive review of Alexander's case, notes that malaria can cause the intense back pain described in the ancient accounts, particularly when it affects the kidneys. The disease can also lead to the jaundice observed in Alexander's final days as the liver becomes compromised. Given that malaria was endemic to the region and that Alexander had spent years campaigning in areas where the disease was prevalent, this diagnosis has substantial plausibility. Typhoid fever represents another strong contender. The bacterium Salmonella typhi, which causes typhoid, was certainly present in ancient Babylon, where sanitation remained primitive by modern standards. Alexander's high fever, extreme thirst, and progressive weakness would be typical of typhoid infection. The disease can also cause neurological symptoms, potentially explaining Alexander's periods of delirium and consciousness described by ancient sources. West Nile virus, another mosquito-borne illness, has gained support among some researchers. This virus can cause encephalitis, brain inflammation leading to neurological symptoms alongside fever. The seasonal timing of Alexander's illness, early summer when mosquito populations would be increasing, lend some credence to this hypothesis. Some medical historians have proposed more exotic diagnoses. Dr. Catherine Hall of the University of Otago suggests that Alexander may not have died at all, at least not when historically recorded. Her controversial theory proposes that Alexander suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune disorder that causes ascending paralysis. This condition could have rendered Alexander completely paralyzed but still conscious, creating the appearance of death in an era before modern diagnostic tools. Acute pancreatitis triggered by Alexander's legendary alcohol consumption represents yet another possibility. This extremely painful inflammation of the pancreas can cause the kind of sudden, agonizing pain described at the banquet, followed by systemic deterioration as digestive enzymes essentially begin consuming the body from within. Other researchers point to liver disease, specifically cirrhosis or hepatitis, as potential culprits. Alexander's reported jaundice and the accounts of his drinking habits support this theory. His final symptoms, fever, abdominal pain, and neurological deterioration, could indicate hepatic encephalopathy, the brain dysfunction that occurs when a damaged liver fails to remove toxins from the blood. Perhaps most intriguing is the possibility that Alexander suffered from an unusual complication of an earlier injury. During the siege of Mali in India in 326 BCE, Alexander was struck by an arrow that penetrated his chest. Though he survived this wound, some medical historians believe it may have created a weakened area in his lung that eventually developed into a lung abscess or empyema, pus in the pleural cavity. Years later in Babylon, this chronic infection could have suddenly worsened, leading to sepsis and eventual death. Death by debauchery. Beyond poison and pathogens lies another possibility, that Alexander's legendary appetite for pleasure contributed significantly to his demise. The conqueror's drinking habits were notorious even in an era when heavy alcohol consumption was commonplace. Ancient sources describe drinking contests where Alexander would consume vast quantities of unmixed wine, a practice even his hard-drinking Macedonian companions found excessive. Plutarch reports that after conquering Drangiana, Alexander spent 7 days in continuous drinking. During another famous episode following the death of the Indian philosopher Calanus, Alexander held a drinking contest that reportedly resulted in the deaths of 41 participants from alcohol poisoning. The winner, Promachus, who consumed some 13 quarts of wine, died 3 days later. These were not isolated incidents but part of a pattern. Alexander increasingly engaged in extended symposia, Greek drinking parties that could last for days. What began as cultural and religious ritual evolved into something more dangerous under Alexander's influence. As his campaigns progressed, so did his consumption. By the time he reached Babylon, some sources suggest he was rarely completely sober. The physiological impact of such behavior would have been severe. Chronic alcohol abuse damages virtually every organ system in the human body. The liver, responsible for metabolizing alcohol, suffers the most direct damage. Alexander's reported jaundice in his final days strongly suggests hepatic involvement, potentially alcoholic hepatitis or cirrhosis. Beyond liver damage, chronic alcohol abuse compromises the immune system, making the body more vulnerable to infection. If Alexander did contract malaria, typhoid, or another infectious disease in Babylon, his alcohol-weakened immune system would have struggled to mount an effective defense. Alexander's drinking may have interacted fatally with the wound he received at Mali. That arrow to the chest likely damaged his lung, creating a vulnerability that his lifestyle would have exacerbated. Heavy drinking can suppress respiratory function and increase the risk of respiratory infections, particularly dangerous for someone with pre-existing lung damage. The psychological aspects of Alexander's behavior deserve consideration as well. His increasing consumption coincided with growing signs of paranoia and mood instability. After the death of his closest companion Hephaestion in 324 BCE, Alexander's drinking reportedly intensified. This pattern of using alcohol to cope with grief and stress, combined with the isolation of supreme power, created dangerous conditions for addiction. Even Alexander's final illness may have been triggered or worsened by alcohol consumption. The banquet at Medius's house, where his symptoms first appeared, followed the pattern of his typical drinking parties. If Alexander was already harboring an infection or inflammation, the dehydrating effects of alcohol combined with the physical stress of extended carousing could have precipitated a crisis. Some historians have noted the similarity between Alexander's death and that of his father, Philip II, who was known for his prodigious drinking before being assassinated. While their ends differed significantly in circumstance, both men embodied the Macedonian cultural tendency toward excessive consumption that crossed the line from celebration into self-destruction, the aftermath and power vacuum. The moment Alexander drew his final breath, the vast empire he had constructed began to fracture. With no clear succession plan in place, the aftermath of his death created one of history's most dramatic power vacuums. The empire that had stretched from Greece to India, unified under a single extraordinary vision, now faced an existential crisis. The immediate question, who will rule, had no simple answer. Though Alexander had a half-brother, Aridaeus, later named Philip III, he suffered from a mental disability that made him incapable of independent rule. Alexander's wife Roxana was pregnant with his child, but the baby, the future Alexander IV, remained unborn when crisis struck. Neither potential heir could step immediately into the conqueror's role. According to Diodorus Siculus, when the dying Alexander was asked to whom he left his kingdom, he replied cryptically, "To the strongest." Whether he actually said this or whether it was attributed to him later to justify the ensuing power struggle remains debated. Other accounts suggest he simply passed his signet ring to Perdiccas, implying his choice for successor. Within days of Alexander's death, the first cracks appeared. His generals and companions, the Diadochi or successors, gathered to determine the empire's fate. The initial compromise seemed reasonable. Perdiccas would serve as regent for the disabled Philip III and the unborn child of Roxana. The vast territories would be divided among generals as satraps, governors, nominally serving the Argead royal house while maintaining their own power bases. This fragile arrangement quickly descended into conflict. Meleger, a prominent infantry commander, initially rejected the compromise, attempting to champion Philip III as the sole legitimate king. After brief fighting in Babylon, Meleger was executed, establishing the pattern of bloody resolution that would characterize the coming decades. Far from Babylon, other challenges emerged. The Greek cities, learning of Alexander's death, revolted in the Lamian War, attempting to throw off Macedonian dominion. In Athens, Demosthenes, the great orator who had long opposed Macedonian expansion, declared, "The young man has died, let's not delay." Their optimism proved premature. The rebellion was crushed the following year. In Macedonia itself, Alexander's mother Olympias and Antipater continued their long-standing feud, creating another center of instability. Meanwhile, the generals appointed to distant satrapies quickly consolidated their positions, building armies loyal to themselves rather than to the nominal kings. By 321 BCE, barely 2 years after Alexander's death, the first full-scale war among the Diadochi erupted. Perdiccas, attempting to maintain central authority, marched against Ptolemy, who had established himself in Egypt and had seized Alexander's corpse during its journey to Macedonia. Perdiccas' assassination by his own officers during this campaign marked the effective end of any pretense of imperial unity. Over the next 4 decades, the wars of the Diadochi would redraw the map of Alexander's conquests. Former brothers-in-arms became bitter enemies. Territories changed hands repeatedly. The royal family, including young Alexander IV and his mother Roxana, became pawns in the larger game, ultimately murdered to prevent them from serving as rallying points for legitimacy. By 281 BCE, with the death of Seleucus IV Nicator, the last surviving companion of Alexander, the empire had permanently fractured into 3 major kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia. These Hellenistic states would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East until the coming of Rome. The Lost Tomb Mystery. Even in death, Alexander continued to generate mysteries that would puzzle generations to come. Chief among these is the strange disappearance of his body and tomb, a physical absence that mirrors the sudden vacuum of power his death created. For a man whose life was so thoroughly documented, the location of his final resting place remains one of history's most perplexing unsolved riddles. Initially, Alexander's body was prepared for funeral rites in Babylon. Ancient accounts describe an elaborate process of embalming using honey and other preservatives, techniques likely combining Egyptian and Babylonian methods. The body was placed in a gold coffin, which was in turn enclosed in a gold sarcophagus. This precious container was then placed in an ornate funeral carriage for transport. The original plan, according to Alexander's own wishes, was for his body to be taken to the oasis of Siwa in Egypt, where he had been proclaimed son of Zeus Ammon years earlier. However, Perdiccas, as regent, initially ordered the funeral procession to head for Macedonia, where Alexander would be buried in the royal tombs at Aegae alongside his ancestors. This journey never reached its destination. In 321 BCE, the funeral cortege was intercepted by Ptolemy, who diverted it to Egypt. This audacious act, essentially hijacking the conqueror's corpse, was a calculated political move. Possession of Alexander's body conferred legitimacy and prestige, turning Egypt into the center of the cult that quickly developed around the deified conqueror. According to multiple ancient sources, including Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, Alexander was initially entombed in Memphis. Later, around 215 BCE, Ptolemy IV constructed a magnificent mausoleum in Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded, and transferred the body there. This structure, known as the Soma, meaning body, became one of the most famous landmarks of the ancient world. For centuries, Alexander's tomb in Alexandria was a site of pilgrimage. Roman emperors, including Julius Caesar, Augustus, Caligula, and Caracalla, visited to pay homage. The geographer Strabo described the tomb as being within a precinct known as the Palaces, writing that the body was contained in a golden sarcophagus, which was later replaced with glass when the original was plundered by Ptolemy V. And then, sometime after the 4th century CE, Alexander's tomb vanishes from historical record. The last reliable mention comes from the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus around 361 CE. After this, silence. No medieval Arab sources mention it, no Byzantine records indicate its location. The tomb, along with the city's famous library, simply disappeared during the turbulent centuries when Alexandria declined from its classical glory. What happened? Theories abound. Some suggest the tomb was destroyed during one of the many conflicts that engulfed Alexandria, perhaps during the Roman civil wars, the Jewish revolt of 115 CE, or Christian rioting against pagan sites in the late 4th century. Others propose that natural disasters, particularly the devastating tsunami of 365 CE or the earthquake of 856 CE, might have destroyed or buried the mausoleum. More intriguing is the possibility that Alexander's body was deliberately moved or hidden. Some traditions claim that early Christians relocated the remains to protect them from desecration or to prevent pagan worship. Venetian legends suggest that Alexander's body was secretly brought to Venice, disguised as the remains of Saint Mark, a theory most historians dismiss as fanciful. Modern archaeological efforts to locate the tomb have been extensive but fruitless. Excavations throughout Alexandria have uncovered fascinating artifacts and structures, but nothing definitively connected to Alexander's mausoleum. In 1995, Greek archaeologist Liana Souvaltsi claimed to have discovered Alexander's tomb at the Siwa oasis, suggesting his wishes were ultimately fulfilled. But this claim has been widely rejected by the archaeological community. One of the most promising recent theories, proposed by archaeologist Calliope Limnaeus Papacosta, suggests the tomb may lie beneath the modern city's Latin cemetery, where ground-penetrating radar has revealed promising subterranean structures. However, definitive evidence remains elusive. Prophetic signs and omens. The ancient world was deeply attuned to omens and portents, viewing them as communications from the gods. In the narratives surrounding Alexander's death, supernatural signs feature prominently, adding another layer to the mystery. Whether these phenomena were actual events, post hoc interpretations, or literary inventions, they reflect how Alexander's contemporaries struggled to make sense of his sudden demise. In the days before Alexander's final illness, several ominous incidents reportedly occurred. According to Plutarch, Alexander was sailing on Babylon's artificial lakes when a strong wind blew his royal diadem off his head. The diadem floated away and caught on some reeds near an ancient royal tomb. A sailor swam out to retrieve it and, finding no other way to keep it dry, placed it on his own head while swimming back, an action some interpreted as foreshadowing usurpation. Another troubling omen involved a stranger. While Alexander sat on his throne conducting business, an unknown man wearing the royal diadem and royal robes wandered into the palace, walked past the guards, and sat on the throne. When questioned, the man reportedly said nothing, causing great consternation among the superstitious Babylonians, who viewed this as a sign of impending regime change. Perhaps most famously, upon entering Babylon for the final time, Alexander was allegedly warned by Chaldean astrologers that death awaited him in the city. They advised him to delay his entry or approach from a different direction. Though initially heeding this warning, Alexander eventually dismissed it after consulting with Greek philosophers who ridiculed Babylonian superstition. Animals often seen as messengers from the divine realm featured in several portents. Plutarch describes an incident where a tame donkey kicked and killed one of the largest and finest lions kept for the king's hunting pleasures, a clear symbol of strength falling to unexpected weakness. In another account, ravens were observed fighting above the palace, with some falling dead at Alexander's feet just days before his illness began. Even the weather seemed to presage calamity. Unusual storms struck Babylon, with lightning reportedly hitting the royal palace. In Macedonia, halfway across the known world, temple statues were said to have sweated or shed tears around the time of Alexander's death. News that could only have reached Babylon well after the fact, but was incorporated into the narrative of divine foreknowledge. After Alexander's death, the omens continued. Plutarch relates that Alexander's body showed no signs of corruption despite the heat of Babylon, taken as evidence of his divine nature. When his sarcophagus was being transported to Egypt, a diadem that had been placed upon it was blown away by the wind and caught in reeds, much like the earlier incident, creating a sense of prophetic repetition. These omens served several purposes in ancient narrative. For a figure of Alexander's stature, an ordinary death seemed insufficient. Cosmic forces had to acknowledge the passing of a world-changing figure. The omens also provided retrospective explanation. If the gods had sent warnings, then Alexander's death, however shocking, was part of a divine plan rather than mere coincidence.